January 10th, 1999, Manitowoc County, Wisconsin. While walking home from a friend's house on a county highway, 17-year-old Ricky Hochstetler is fatally struck by a vehicle in a hit-and-run. Police announced that parts from a Chevrolet truck or van were found at the scene, but an extensive investigation fails to turn up the vehicle which hit Ricky. As the years go on, the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department face allegations of orchestrating a cover-up, and rumors spread that an off-duty police officer may have been responsible for Ricky's death. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be covering a cold case involving a hit and run, the 1999 death of 17-year-old Ricky Hochstetler. That voice you just heard narrate our intro was Stephanie Rouleau, the winner of this month's Trail Went Cold listener voiceover contest, so thank you very much, Stephanie. In case you haven't heard, getting the opportunity to read the opening of one of our episodes has been a popular recurring monthly contest for us, and if you'd like to enter, and haven't already done so, I will be providing instructions near the end of this episode. Anyway, there are a number of reasons I've chosen to cover the Ricky Hochstetler case right now. For starters, we just passed the 20th anniversary of Ricky's death back in January, but the most intriguing thing about this story is that it happened to take place in Manitowoc County, Wisconsin. As you probably know, that place has become pretty infamous in recent years because it is where Steven Avery was convicted of the 2005 murder of Teresa Halbach, a controversial case which captured worldwide attention on the true crime documentary Making Her Murderer. Well, today's episode is not going to be about that particular crime, but it's no secret that Steven Avery's supporters believe his conviction was the result of rampant corruption within the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department, who framed him for the murder. When browsing online discussions about the case, I would sometimes see references to Ricky Hochstetler, so I finally decided to dive down that rabbit hole and see what this particular story was about. Since Ricky's death took place only 6 years before Teresa Halbach's murder, it involved many of the same Manitowoc County law enforcement figures you saw featured in Making Her Murderer, and needless to say, there's a lot of controversy surrounding this investigation as well. One of the most prominent rumors is that a police officer may have been responsible for the hit and run which took Ricky's life, and a cover-up was orchestrated to protect him. Since I've yet to see this case featured on a podcast, I decided it would be a good time to tackle it, because regardless of whether you believe any of the conspiracy theories in this story, a teenage kid lost his life and has never received justice. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the unsolved death of Ricky Hochstetler. Our story begins in Manitowoc County, Wisconsin in 1999, and our central figure is Richard Hochstetler, who goes by the name Ricky. Ricky is a 17-year-old junior at Lincoln High School who plays on their football team and holds a part-time job at Hardee's. His parents are divorced, and his father has moved to Illinois, so Ricky lives with his mother, Debbie Hochstetler, and 2 young sisters, in a farmhouse just outside of the town of Manitowoc. On Saturday, January 9th, Debbie dropped Ricky off at a friend's house for a pizza party in which they would spend the evening watching movies. Ricky left shortly before 2 a.m. on the morning of January 10th, and even though there was a snowstorm brewing outside, he elected to walk home. At 2:25 a.m., a woman named Sandra Schindler was driving on County Road CR delivering newspapers when she came across Ricky's body in the middle of the highway just north of Silver Creek Road. It was apparent that Ricky had been struck by a vehicle and was the victim of a hit and run. Schindler immediately used her cell phone to call for assistance, and it would only be 3 minutes before Lieutenant Mike Bushman of the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department arrived at the scene. Bushman would later claim that he was patrolling the area and had seen Ricky's fresh footprints in the snow by the side of the road about a mile away from where he was killed. Since there was a storm going on, Bushman said he was planning to track down the person who made the footprints and ask if they needed assistance, but he pulled over to get gas first. Within minutes, he would receive a radio call about the discovery of Ricky's body. Unfortunately, Ricky's injuries, which included a skull fracture, brain trauma, spinal cord injury, as well as neck and back fractures, were so severe that he was immediately pronounced dead at the scene when the coroner arrived. Tire tracks showed that Ricky had been walking south on the west shoulder of the highway, which had a 50-mile-per-hour speed limit, when he was struck from behind and dragged more than 80 yards beneath the vehicle. There was no evidence that the driver had made any attempt to stop and help Ricky before they continued heading south, and it was theorized that they were either intoxicated or had fallen asleep at the wheel when they veered off the highway and struck Ricky. Since it was snowing hard, and Ricky only had a light dusting of snow on his body, it seemed apparent this had occurred a very short time before Sandra Schindler had discovered him. Even though Schindler remembered having seen 2 cars and 2 trucks in the general area at that time, she had no reason to pay any attention to them and could not provide a description. In a cruel twist of fate, Ricky's body was discovered only 50 yards from his house. His mother, Debbie, would be awoken at 4:30 a.m. by knocking at the front door, and initially figured it was Ricky because he had forgotten his key. But tragically, it was the police who informed her about Ricky's death. Even though he was off duty at the time, Lieutenant Robert Herman, a juvenile jail administrator for the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department, was summoned to the accident scene to examine parts from the hit-and-run vehicle which were found on the road. Lieutenant Bushman wanted Herman's input because he had an extensive knowledge of vehicles, as his family owned a salvage yard located only a few miles away in the village of Cleveland. Herman had worked as a mechanic and auto body repair technician at the yard and would retrofit vehicles the department purchased for squad cars. He decided to collect the parts from the hit-and-run scene and would spend the next few hours driving around and performing his own independent investigation. According to Herman, he canvassed some local auto dealerships and businesses in hopes of finding a match until he came across a vehicle containing a gray-colored grille, which he believed resembled some broken grille fragments found at the scene. By 9 a.m. that morning, Herman informed the sheriff's department that he believed the vehicle they were looking for was a 1985 to 1988 Chevrolet Suburban, Blazer, or full-size pickup truck, and this information would soon be shared with the media. Within a few weeks, it was announced that the grille pieces might also be a match for a 1988 to 1991 full-size Chevrolet van. It was estimated that there were around 25,000 registered vehicles matching that description in Manitowoc and the surrounding counties at that time, so the police obtained a master list of the vehicles and started checking into them. A reward fund for information was put together, which eventually reached $25,000, and a roadside memorial was put up at the spot where Ricky's body was found. On the same morning of the accident, Robert Jeffrey, a resident of the nearby town of Newton, was on his way to church when he claimed he saw some broken vehicle parts at the remote intersection of Newton Road and Center Road, located just under 5 miles southwest of where Ricky was killed. Even though Jeffrey reported it, the police did not make an attempt to collect the parts for several weeks. They had to wait for the weather conditions to improve so that firefighters could visit the intersection and use water to melt the snow in order to find the parts. Since the intersection was a rarely used one, this suggested that the driver was a local resident who knew the area well, especially since the route to Center Road would have taken them right past Interstate 43, which an outsider likely would have used if they wanted to skip town. On January 15th, following Ricky's funeral, a friend of the Hochstetler family discovered some more broken vehicle parts in the thawing snow near the edge of the driveway at the Hochstetler residence. The parts were collected by police, and given that Ricky had been found only 50 yards away, it was suspected that they also belonged to the hit-and-run vehicle. However, Lieutenant Bushman soon announced that the pieces had been ruled out as having any connection to the accident, since he believed they belonged to a newer vehicle and did not match the late 80s model Chevy truck or van they were searching for. Another potentially promising lead was a local banquet hall called Club Bilmar, located on County Road CR, only a quarter-mile north of where Ricky was killed. On the evening of January 9th, the club had hosted parties for employees from some local businesses, Manitowoc Ice and Kopp's grocery store, so there was speculation that the motorist who struck Ricky may have been driving away from there after a night of drinking. Two of the bartenders who closed the club that night were interviewed, and one of them, Alvin Merzinski, even claimed that he passed Ricky walking down the highway shortly before his death. However, neither of the bartenders was able to offer any useful information, and Ken Peterson, the Manitowoc County undersheriff at that time, even told the press that they did not suspect the driver was someone who drove away from the club, since they found it unlikely the vehicle would have had enough time to reach the necessary speeds to have inflicted the severe injuries found on Ricky's body. Unfortunately, even though the sheriff's department performed an extensive check into Chevrolet trucks and vans from the area, they were unable to find a match to the hit-and-run vehicle, and the investigation reached a standstill. In June of 2000, the graduating class at Lincoln High School held a moment of silence at their ceremony in honor of Ricky, who would have graduated alongside them if he had lived. At the time the crime took place, the current Manitowoc County Sheriff was Tom Kosurik, but after serving 22 years, he finally decided to retire. Ken Peterson took over as the new sheriff and appointed Robert Herman to be his undersheriff, with Michael Bushman being promoted to Deputy Inspector of Operations, the department's third in command. In 2002, Peterson publicly addressed the lack of progress in the investigation into Ricky's death. He believed that short of a confession, the case might never be solved, stating, quote, "What it's going to take to solve the thing would just be luck at this point. I doubt if that truck exists anymore, especially in any kind of evidentiary form," end quote. However, the case took a surprising turn in 2004, when Debbie Hochstetler was interviewed by a Green Bay TV station who aired a story about her son's death. Shortly thereafter, Debbie received an anonymous phone call from a woman who told her that the person who killed Ricky was a police officer named Herman, and the vehicle which struck him wound up being crushed at the Herman family's auto salvage yard. Now, it's worth mentioning that even though the caller did apparently provide the perpetrator's first name, Debbie could not remember it. This is an important point, because while the aforementioned Lieutenant Robert Herman was heavily involved in the investigation, his brother, Todd Herman, was a traffic patrol sergeant with the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department. Anyway, Debbie went to the police with this information, but Mike Bushman assured her that Rob Herman was not a suspect. At the time, the detective assigned to Ricky's case was James Lenk, a name you probably recognize from Making a Murderer, but I'll talk more about that later. Debbie requested to review the original police reports about Ricky's death, but both Bushman and Lenk declined to hand them over, telling her that the details were too graphic for her to handle emotionally. Debbie then inquired about bringing in outside assistance from the Wisconsin Division of Criminal Investigation, aka the DCI, but Lenk told her that he had already tried to contact them and was told they did not help local police agencies investigate vehicular homicides. In spite of this, Debbie decided to take the initiative to contact the DCI on her own. She learned that Lenk had never actually contacted them, and that his claim about them not investigating vehicular homicides was untrue, so a special agent named Eric Zatkowski was assigned to the case. Zatkowski would question Rob Herman, who denied any involvement in Ricky's death, and claimed that he was at home that night sleeping with his live-in girlfriend, Laura King Lee, and their 2-year-old son before he was awakened by a phone call at 3 a.m. asking him to investigate the accident scene. Zatkowski also learned that in November of 1999, Mike Bushman had brought in Rick Wettenkamp, Ricky's stepfather at the time of the accident, for an interview, and informed him that rumors had been circulating that Ricky might have been killed by an off-duty deputy and that there was a cover-up going on. Bushman apparently did this to gauge Rick's reaction, and Rick soon admitted that he was the one who started these rumors, which subsequently died down until Debbie received the anonymous phone call in 2004. Zatkowski eventually closed his probe, concluding that he could find no evidence that Herman or anyone from the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department had direct involvement in the hit and run or any alleged cover-up. However, he did have a number of concerns with how former Sheriff Tom Kocourek had handled the initial investigation. After the parts found at the accident scene were matched to a Chevrolet vehicle, Kocourek elected not to bring in the DCI or crash reconstruction experts from the Wisconsin State Patrol to provide any assistance. No surveillance checkpoints were set up near the crime scene, and the police never canvassed the area for leads or suspects. When Debbie Hochstetler wanted to mobilize a team of volunteers to search the back roads for vehicle debris, Sheriff Kocourek rejected her idea. While Kocourek did submit the vehicle parts from the accident scene to the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. for analysis, he waited an entire year to do so. While the FBI agreed that the parts may have belonged to a late 80s model Chevrolet, they were not able to determine the exact year, make, or model. When reviewing reports about all the Chevy vehicles which were cleared by investigators, Agent Zatkowski found it concerning that many of them did not contain specific details about how or why they were cleared. He cited another hit-and-run case from 2002 where the responsible vehicle had passed inspection by the local police on 2 occasions before the DCI uncovered evidence that it was involved in the crime. In his final report, Agent Zatkowski included a 5-page list of recommendations to help the Sheriff's Department rejuvenate the investigation. This included taking some tan paint chips with black primer recovered from Ricky's clothing and sending them to a laboratory in Canada which contained an advanced tool for identifying paint chips called Paint Data Query that could potentially help investigators narrow down the make and model of the vehicle. But it's unclear if the department ever followed any of these recommendations. Ken Peterson retired as Manitowoc County Sheriff in 2006, and none other than Robert Herman would be elected to replace him, and he continues to hold the office to this day. In 2009, the DCI would decide to reopen their investigation into Ricky's death, based largely on an anonymous phone call they received. The caller claimed they'd heard from friends of Robert Herman that he once owned an early to mid-1980s Chevy pickup truck which suddenly disappeared around the time of Ricky's death, lending credence to the idea that it was the hit-and-run vehicle. DCI investigators decided to contact Laura King Lee, who was Herman's live-in girlfriend at the time the accident took place, though they'd long since broken up. While Herman claimed he was at home sleeping on the night of the crime until the police phoned him at 3 a.m., Lee claimed that she could not recall if this happened or not, but since 10 years had passed by this point, this did not disprove Herman's alibi. Lee did not remember ever having seen anything suspicious from Herman to make her believe he may have been involved in the accident, and while she maintained an amicable relationship with Herman, Lee stated that she would never intentionally cover for him. But she did provide a suggestion for the DCI to check into the Club Bilmar Banquet Hall to see if they might have a guest list of who was there on the night Ricky was killed. Well, the DCI did contact the club's owner, but were told they no longer kept any records about that after 10 years. After looking through the case files, the DCI found it surprising that the only people from the club questioned by the Sheriff's Department were the 2 bartenders who were there that night, and there was nothing more than very brief summaries of their interviews. But once again, they could not find any evidence that a cover-up had taken place, so the investigation remained at a standstill. In January of 2016, Debbie Hochstetler met with the lieutenant detective now assigned to her case, Andrew Colburn. And well, if you've seen Making a Murderer, you definitely know who he is, but more on that in a little while. Debbie secretly tape-recorded her conversation with Colburn, and you can actually find the entire audio on YouTube. Much like the previous investigators, Colburn expressed little hope that Ricky's case would be solved unless someone came forward with a confession. However, Colburn did present a few theories. He speculated that the driver may have been an undocumented illegal worker who immediately fled the country following the accident, and Colburn also pointed the finger at a former Manitowoc resident who ran a taxi company near the location where Ricky was killed. But since this man had died in 2006, he could no longer be investigated. When Debbie asked Colburn for the original master list of all the registered Chevy vehicles which were investigated and cleared by the department, Colburn said he had no idea what happened to it. While Debbie's conversation with Colburn was taking place, she couldn't help but notice that Sheriff Robert Herman was in earshot the entire time, with the door to his office partially open. It would be in September of that year when journalist John Farrick of the USA Today Network Wisconsin published a 3-part investigative expose about the Ricky Hochstetler case, which addressed the allegations of a cover-up and pulled no punches in showcasing the many problems with the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department's investigation. It mentioned that one former employee of the department went so far as to resign in disgust over the shoddiness of the investigation. In particular, harsh criticism was directed at the handling of the evidence from the accident scene. Under Mike Bushman's direction, the broken vehicle parts which were found were not properly tagged, logged, photographed, or collected by trained evidence technicians. The parts were turned over to Robert Herman, who was allowed to drive around unsupervised with the evidence inside his personal vehicle for the next several hours. After this, the parts were kept inside an unsecured cabinet at the police station, which any of the employees could have accessed. The article featured quotes from Brent Turvey, a forensic scientist from Forensic Solutions in Alaska, who thought these actions seriously violated chain of custody standards. Turvey stated, quote, "You can get fired for that stuff. That piece of evidence might not as well exist. You have made that evidence have less value or no value at all." End quote. Pete Bates, an investigator who worked for Steven Avery's defense team, was also interviewed, and after reviewing the autopsy report, he stated his belief that Ricky's injuries were consistent with having been hit by a car, not a truck. In February of 2018, Andrew Colburn retired from the Sheriff's Department, and Ricky's case has now been turned over to Jason Jost, the sheriff's deputy who had collected the vehicle parts found near Debbie Hochstetler's driveway, which were ultimately dismissed as having any connection to the case. As far as anyone can tell, no analysis has ever been performed on those particular parts. As for Debbie, she has reached the point where she no longer has any real interest in prosecuting the person who was responsible for the death of her son, but she would still like to receive some answers and find out this person's identity. She has openly stated, quote, "Give me the opportunity to forgive you. My purpose now isn't to get this person in jail. My purpose is to talk to this person. We need to finish our healing process." End quote. Debbie does not believe the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department will ever solve the case, but is still hoping that perhaps the Department of Justice or the FBI might take it on. But after 20 years, the hit-and-run death of Ricky Hochstetler continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Okay, for starters, I just wanted to get it out of the way that I'm not going to use this episode to share my thoughts about the murder of Teresa Halbach and discuss whether or not Steven Avery or Brendan Dassey are actually guilty of that crime. That's way too large a topic, and I want to keep things completely focused on the death of Ricky Hochstetler because that's still a cold case in which no one has ever faced justice. But since many of the same Manitowoc County law enforcement officers were involved in both these cases, it's difficult not to draw a number of parallels. I'm sure most of you have seen Making a Murderer and Making a Murderer 2, and are aware that it pushed forward the narrative that the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department planted evidence to frame Steven Avery for Teresa Halbach's murder. This stems from the fact that they arrested Avery in 1985 for a rape he did not commit, and after being wrongly incarcerated for 18 years and cleared by DNA testing, Avery had filed a $36 million civil suit against the department. It's a heavily divided issue, but there are also some people who think that even though Avery is actually guilty of this murder, evidence was still planted to make a stronger case against him. Whatever side you fall on, I will say that the Ricky Hochstetler case really doesn't do the Sheriff's Department any favors. Instead of allegations of planting evidence to frame someone, the narrative this time around is that they planted false evidence to protect someone and help them get away with it. Quite frankly, I'm kind of surprised this case was not mentioned in either of the Making a Murderer documentaries. I mentioned that a lot of the police officers in this episode had ties to the Steven Avery case, but here's a refresher. The Manitowoc County Sheriff at the time of Ricky's death was Tom Kosarik, who played a major role in Avery's wrongful rape conviction and was a defendant in the civil suit. James Lank and Andrew Colburn were each the lead investigator on Ricky's case at various points, and didn't seem overly interested in solving it, and if you've seen Making a Murderer, you'll know that both these men have been accused of planting evidence during a search of Avery's property to frame him for the Halbach murder. Mike Bushman, the first officer on the scene when Ricky was killed, was one of the deputies who arrested Avery on his rape charge in 1985, and he actually came out of retirement to participate in the aforementioned search of Avery's salvage yard. And Robert and Todd Herman, the two police officers who have each been considered possible suspects in Ricky's death, were also involved in that search. Hell, even Jason Jost, the investigator currently assigned to Ricky's case, was the first person who found a bone fragment near Avery's burn pit at the salvage yard. Regardless of whether you believe the allegations of evidence planting, it's undeniable that the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department caused some major friction by even being involved in the search of Avery's property to begin with, because of the obvious conflict of interest with the civil suit. And unfortunately, they seem to show the same type of recklessness when they handled their investigation into Ricky Hochstetler's death. Of course, Making a Murderer was released in December of 2015, and if the documentary had not painted such an unflattering picture of the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department, I'm not sure if the allegations about a cover-up in Ricky's case would have garnered much mainstream traction. While there were always rumors circulating about this, and the Wisconsin Division of Criminal Investigation looked into them on 2 separate occasions, the allegations really didn't get much publicity until John Farrick published his 3-part series of articles in September of 2016. This past November, Farrick released a book titled Wrecking Crew: Demolishing the Case Against Steven Avery, in which he devoted an entire chapter outlining the problems in the Ricky Hochstetler investigation, and he definitely believes that a Manitowoc County police officer was responsible for Ricky's death. It's quite a crazy coincidence that the prime suspect hailed from a family who owned a salvage yard, since the Avery family's salvage yard played such a huge role in that particular case. Before I move on from Steven Avery, there's one more mind-blowing coincidence I wanted to mention. On February 5th, 1999, less than 1 month after Ricky's death, 2 other high school juniors were killed in a car accident in the nearby town of Kossuth after colliding with a garbage truck. The crash was investigated by the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department, and the victims were 17-year-old Stephen Gore and 16-year-old Corey Avery. Yes, Corey Avery was Steven Avery's nephew, the son of Steven's brother Chuck, and he was technically Brendan Dassey's cousin. You can even find a couple of newspaper articles about the accident, which make mention of it alongside Ricky's death, so it's pretty insane just how much these 2 stories seem to be joined at the hip. Now, the big complication is that the same family who owned the aforementioned salvage yard now run the Sheriff's Department, as Robert Herman is sheriff, and Todd Herman is Deputy Inspector of Operations, which is the 3rd highest ranking position. So I'm sure this does nothing to dispel the rumors that the department is a quote-unquote good old boys club, and if the Herman brothers had any involvement in Ricky's death, then it's hard to imagine the case will be solved while they are in power. Anyway, let's go back and start at the very beginning and explore how events unfolded on the night Ricky was killed. We know that Ricky left his friend's house to walk home shortly before 2 a.m. This might seem like an unusual decision since there was a snowstorm and Ricky could have always called his mother for a ride, but I believe he was out a bit past curfew that night, which is probably why he didn't want to contact her. His route home on County Road CR was not a well-lit area, and given the lousy weather, poor visibility may have been one of the factors in how Ricky got hit by a vehicle. The Hochstetler family has always believed that Ricky's death was legitimately an accident and that the driver did not run him down intentionally. Ricky's father even stated that if the driver had pulled over and at least made an attempt to help Ricky, then he would have been able to forgive them, but since they immediately fled the scene, and the evidence suggested they didn't even stop for one moment, he doesn't think he'll ever be able to offer forgiveness. The driver's actions seem to suggest that they were intoxicated when they struck Ricky. Given that this took place just down the road from the Club Bilmar Banquet Hall, where a number of parties were being held that night, it's pretty plausible to think that the perpetrator was a drunk driver who was leaving that location. But one of the most jaw-dropping aspects of this investigation is how little the banquet hall was investigated. According to police reports, the only people who were interviewed were the 2 bartenders working there that night. Right from the outset, it seemed like police completely ruled out the possibility that the driver came from the club, as Under Sheriff Ken Peterson did an interview in which he stated that this person's vehicle would not have had enough time to generate the necessary amount of speed to inflict the severe injuries found on Ricky's body. And that explanation sounds completely ridiculous to me. Ricky was found a quarter mile from the club. What kind of a vehicle can't generate enough speed in a quarter mile to cause a fatal hit and run with serious injuries? It's a pretty brash assumption to use that as the basis to completely rule out the banquet hall as a viable lead, so compiling a list of names of every single person who was in attendance there that night really should have been the police's top priority. This only gives off the impression that the investigation wanted to divert all attention away from the club. I find it very interesting that we have 2 separate witnesses who were in very close proximity to Ricky in the moments before he was killed, but neither of them saw anything. One of the bartenders, Alvin Mrzinski, flat out admitted that he passed by Ricky on the side of the road while he was driving away from the club. I found a blog about the Steven Avery case which broke down this whole situation, and in particular, they expressed suspicion about how after seeing a teenager walking down the highway in the middle of a snowstorm, Mrzinski wouldn't have at least attempted to stop and offer him a ride. Well, on its own, I wouldn't find this overly suspicious, as some people might be reluctant to stop for someone on a dark road in the middle of the night. But then we also have the story provided by Lieutenant Mike Bushman, the first officer to arrive at the scene. As you recall, Bushman arrived only 3 minutes after Sandra Schindler made her 911 call upon discovering Ricky's body because he happened to be patrolling the area. Bushman claimed he saw fresh footprints in the snow by the side of the road, and once he caught up to the person who made those footprints, he was going to ask them if they needed assistance. But Bushman decided to pull over and get gas first, and it was during this brief window of time that Ricky was presumably run down. It does seem a bit odd that Bushman would be concerned about someone walking down the highway at 2:20 a.m. in the middle of a snowstorm, but not concerned enough that he couldn't wait to fill up his car with gas until after he found them. When you combine Bushman and Mrzinski's stories together, it does seem pretty convenient that they were both very close to Ricky right before he was killed, yet were not around at the exact moment of the hit and run, and neither of them happened to catch a glimpse of the responsible vehicle driving through the area. But there's another wild card in this scenario, and that's the second bartender who worked at Club Bilmar that night. Even though he was interviewed, his name is not mentioned in the official report. While this bartender apparently did not have any information to offer, unless there is a specific reason for withholding their identity, such as a concern about protecting their identity, it's generally standard protocol for police to always include the name of witnesses they interview in their reports. So was the second bartender's name left out by mistake? Or were there other ulterior reasons for not including this information? It's unbelievable that no one even attempted to obtain a guest list for the parties that night until the DCI performed their own investigation 10 years later, but by that point, those records no longer existed. And that's a shame, because I do believe there is a good chance the hit-and-run driver was there and had been drinking before they left. So now let's talk about the Sheriff's Department's handling of the accident scene, because it sounds like it's enough to give most seasoned crime scene investigators a coronary. To recap, the official story is that Lieutenant Robert Herman was woken up in the middle of the night to investigate the crash because even though his official job at the time was a juvenile jail administrator, they thought his extensive knowledge of vehicles would be useful. Herman came from a family who owned a salvage yard, so if he looked at the broken parts and debris at the scene, he might have a pretty good idea of what type of vehicle they originated from. That is a pretty logical assessment, but the problem is that Bushman just flat out allowed Herman to take the parts from the scene and drive around with them for several hours without going through the proper procedures you're supposed to follow when collecting evidence. That is why the entire concept of chain of custody exists. If by some miracle the police had actually made an arrest in this case and brought a suspect to trial, a good defense attorney would have had a field day dismantling the evidence against them. To reiterate, Herman was technically not even on duty at that time, and he was completely unsupervised when he had the evidence in his possession. He claimed he visited a bunch of auto dealerships to look for possible matches, which is what led him to the conclusion that the parts belonged to a late 1980s model Chevrolet truck. But of course, since this all happened in the middle of the night, no one could verify if Herman actually visited these places. If you believe there was a cover-up in this case, it's really not hard to dream up a scenario for what was happening there. Herman's family owned a salvage yard, so if he really wanted to ensure the real hit-and-run vehicle was never found, he would have had unlimited access to parts from a number of different vehicles. He could easily dispose of the evidence from the accident scene and then obtain parts from some wrecked Chevy truck in order to fashion a cover story that this was the vehicle they were looking for. Remember, Herman literally matched these parts to a vehicle within hours of the accident, which must have seemed like amazing police work at the time. But the problem is that the department hinged their entire investigation on Herman's belief that the hit-and-run vehicle was a Chevy truck or van, and this prevented them from pursuing any other leads. This was either a serious case of tunnel vision, or they did not actually want this crime to be solved. Of course, right from the outset, there were examples of investigators ignoring other promising leads, most especially the vehicle parts found near the edge of the driveway to Ricky's home, only 50 yards away from where his body was found. The police immediately dismissed the idea that these parts had any connection to the case because they looked like they belonged to a newer vehicle instead of the 1980s model truck they were searching for. Well, it goes without saying that this was completely irresponsible police work. Really, what are the odds that pieces from a completely unrelated vehicle would be found on the road near the scene of a recent hit and run? I have no doubt those parts did belong to the vehicle which struck Ricky, and they probably did not belong to a Chevy truck. Unfortunately, no testing or analysis has ever been done on the parts, and I don't even know if they're still being kept as evidence today. And there were also the vehicle parts which were seen at the intersection of Newton Road and Center Road on the morning of January 10th, just a few hours after Ricky was killed. Once again, the Sheriff's Department seemed pretty dismissive of these parts, and it was weeks before they actually collected them. It doesn't sound like they tried to deny these parts belonged to the hit-and-run vehicle, but they totally downplayed them. Well, I'd wager these parts did not belong to a Chevy truck either. The remote location of this intersection lends credence to the idea that the driver was a local resident who knew the back roads very well, but the most intriguing thing about this location is that Center Road led directly to the nearby village of Cleveland about 5 minutes away, which is where the Herman family salvage yard happened to be located. Rumors have circulated that the hit-and-run vehicle was either repaired or completely destroyed at the salvage yard, so theoretically, if one of the Herman brothers was the driver, that would be the first place they'd want to go, and if they were traveling from County Road CR, they probably would have taken that intersection. What's apparent is that the Sheriff's Department appeared to have no interest in pursuing any leads which did not involve a Chevrolet truck or van, and those leads did not go anywhere. Another criticism levied against them is that even though the discovery of the vehicle parts at the intersection suggested that the driver lived in the area, Sheriff Kosorek sent his investigators to check out leads in different cities in Wisconsin, which many felt was a complete waste of time and resources. And while they checked into a number of registered vehicles matching the description Herman provided, and supposedly cleared a lot of them, they did not exactly do a stellar job of record keeping, so trying to backtrack which vehicles they investigated after all these years sounds impossible. Overall, the whole investigation sounded like a wild goose chase, and may have been intentionally orchestrated to be that way. I'm pretty certain that the actual vehicle which struck Ricky is long gone by now, and may have been completely destroyed within hours of the accident. Of course, I do have to acknowledge the possibility of Hanlon's razor. Never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. Since hit-and-run cases are often difficult to solve, perhaps the inadequacies of the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department's investigation were the results of laziness and incompetence rather than a deliberate cover-up. You can interpret the whole situation either way, but there are red flags that the department did not want to solve the case and just wanted it to go away. Shortly after he became the new sheriff, Ken Peterson publicly stated that the chances of solving this were not great, and it would require a lot of luck, but the case was only 3 years old at this point, so this comes across as a very pessimistic attitude. And then there's the way Andrew Colburn and James Lenk handled things when they were lead investigators on the case. These two have always been linked side by side because of making a murderer, but to be fair to Colburn, Debbie Hochstetler has praised him for being compassionate when talking to her about the investigation. But having listened to the recording of the conversation, Colburn isn't too subtle at inferring that there really isn't anything he can do to solve the case. He brings up the possibility of a currently deceased taxi entrepreneur being the driver, but doesn't seem to base this on anything more than the guy's business being in close proximity to where Ricky was killed. And he also presented a theory that the driver was an illegal immigrant working in the area who immediately fled the country following the accident, which would make him nearly impossible to catch. Neither of Colburn's theories is impossible, of course, but the problem is that he's basing them on nothing more than pure speculation, and it seems like he's hoping that Debbie will just accept one of these explanations and move on. Now, James Lenk's handling of the investigation is a lot more troubling, since he was flat out caught in a lie. As you recall, he told Debbie that he called the DCI for assistance, and they said they didn't help local police agencies investigate vehicular homicides, a claim which was later refuted by the DCI. Once again, this could just be an example of Lenk being lazy and disinterested in the case, rather than covering something up, but it still looks pretty suspicious. Now, it must be said that even though the DCI conducted 2 separate investigations into Ricky's case, and did not hesitate to share their criticism about how the Sheriff's Department handled things, they could not find any evidence that Robert Herman or anyone else connected to the department was involved in the hit and run, or that they orchestrated a cover-up. It sounds like the finger pointing at Herman really started when Debbie received an anonymous phone call about him in 2004, and the DCI felt compelled to launch a second investigation after receiving another anonymous call which implicated him 5 years later. Yes, there definitely is good reason to be suspicious of Herman because of how he handled the vehicle parts found at the accident scene, but the implication that he himself was the driver of the hit-and-run vehicle seems to be based on nothing more than rumors. Herman's alibi is that he was sleeping at home with his girlfriend, Laura King Lee, until he received a phone call from the police for assistance at 3 a.m. When Lee was interviewed by the DCI in 2009, she was unable to 100% corroborate Herman's alibi, but that's only because she could not exactly remember what happened, not because Herman was lying. This interview was 10 years after the fact, so Lee's memory of that particular night really doesn't mean that much. It's possible that Herman's story is 100% true, but he still covered up evidence in order to protect the person who actually did hit Ricky. Remember, the caller who spoke to Debbie said the person who killed her son was a cop named Herman, but Debbie could not be certain of their first name. This is what has fueled rumors that the real hit-and-run driver was Robert Herman's brother, Todd Herman, who also worked for the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department. But there's nothing concrete to implicate Todd Herman at all, and I see no indication that he personally did anything shady in the course of this investigation. This is one of the most frustrating aspects of this case. There is definitely compelling evidence that the Sheriff's Department covered something up, but other than a few anonymous phone calls implicating Robert Herman, there isn't any real evidence to point at any specific individual as being the driver. The perpetrator could have been a police officer, but it also could have been someone else the police felt compelled to protect. You might recall that a year and a half ago, I released an episode about the unsolved death of Kevin Showalter, who was killed in a hit-and-run accident on Christmas Eve in 1973. In that particular case, the prime suspect was a prominent local citizen who happened to be the town's former mayor, which might have been why the police showed very little initiative to solve the case. This is one of the reasons why it's so frustrating that the Club Bilmar was not investigated immediately, and there are no existing records of who would have been attending the parties which were held there that night. Since the driver who hit Ricky made no attempt to stop, this lends credence to them being intoxicated at the time, and the club seems like the most obvious place where a drunk driver would have originated from. Now for years, it appears there was a misconception online that a cop party was being held at the club that night, which only fueled the rumors about the driver being a police officer, but I think this confusion came about because one of the businesses holding a party there was named Cop's Grocery Store. The banquet hall was open to the public, so it's certainly possible that a cop such as Robert Herman or Todd Herman frequented the place that night, but we don't know for sure. I know the anonymous caller who contacted the DCI in 2009 said they'd been told that Robert Herman drove a late 1980s model Chevy pickup which went missing around the time of Ricky's death, but I'm a bit skeptical about this. If Herman was the driver, I don't think he would have specifically named the same type of truck he drove as the hit-and-run vehicle, because I'm sure that would have raised a lot more eyebrows. I think the vehicle which struck Ricky was an entirely different model than a Chevy, which is why Herman might have selected parts from that particular vehicle from his family's salvage yard in order to present them as evidence. The fact that they wanted all resources of the investigation focused on finding a truck or a van suggests to me that the vehicle involved was actually a car. As I previously mentioned, that's the same conclusion Steven Avery's defense investigator, Pete Bates, reached after reviewing the autopsy findings. If either Robert or Todd Herman owned a car which suddenly disappeared around the time of the accident, then that would definitely look suspicious. Whoever the owner of the hit-and-run vehicle was, the discovery of the vehicle parts at the intersection of Newton and Center Road seems to indicate they were heading in the direction of the salvage yard. Whether the driver was Robert, Todd, or someone else, they seemed to know that this was the best place to destroy evidence and cover up the crime, and the Sheriff's Department was more than willing to enable this. If this is what really happened, then there might not be any evidence left to conclusively link anyone in this crime, and the only chance of it being solved is if someone decides to come forward and make a confession. In the aforementioned Kevin Showalter case, the victim's mother pretty much had to single-handedly fight for justice for her son. A grand jury investigation was eventually launched, and they did publicly name a suspect whom they believed was the probable driver of the hit-and-run vehicle which struck Kevin, but they did not recommend a criminal prosecution since there was no longer enough evidence to take the case to trial. I could see a similar scenario unfolding here someday. Debbie Hochstetler has openly stated that she has no interest in prosecuting the person who killed her son, but she just wants to find out what actually happened so she can complete her healing process. There is a chance the perpetrator may develop a conscience someday and decide to reveal what they did, but until that happens, this case is going to be very difficult to solve. However, if by chance, the lid blows off the Steven Avery investigation someday, and rampant corruption in the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department is proven, then perhaps information about what actually happened to Ricky may come to light. Even if the Sheriff's Department did not intentionally orchestrate a cover-up, their handling of the investigation still did a great disservice to Ricky and his family. And if they weren't complicit at all, and the perpetrator was just some motorist with no connections to the police, that doesn't change the fact that a 17-year-old lost his life at the hands of someone who did not even stop to help him after they cost him his life. So if you happen to have any information on the death of Ricky Hochstetler, please contact the appropriate authorities. And by appropriate authorities, I probably recommend the Wisconsin Division of Criminal Investigation, since I don't exactly have much faith in you-know-who. Anyway, another special thanks to Stephanie Rouleau for doing such a great job at narrating our opening. If you want to enter our listener voiceover contest and haven't done so yet, all you have to do is send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, naming the one unsolved cold case you would most like to see covered on this podcast. So once again, send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. We've got another exclusive episode lined up sometime this month. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to take a moment to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up to support us on Patreon, and they are Rachel, Crystal K, and Dominique H. Thank you all so much for your support. And you may have heard that for the third consecutive year, I will be representing The Trail Went Cold by appearing on Podcast Row at CrimeCon, being held at the Hilton Riverside Hotel in New Orleans from June 7th until the 9th. If you would like to purchase tickets to the event, but haven't already done so, we have our own personalized promo code you can use in order to get 10% off a standard badge. So to receive your 10% discount, please visit crimecon.com and enter the promo code COLD19. That's COLD19. In addition, I will also be appearing at another event, the True Crime Podcast Festival, being held at the Marriott Downtown Hotel in Chicago on July 13th. So to learn more information about this event and to purchase tickets, feel free to visit their website at tcpf2019.com. That's tcpf2019.com. Also, just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.